This is a human brain. Your brain, your brain, your brain, my brain are all different. Each of us has a brain that's unique. This is a model that's supposed to stand in for all of ours, but each of us has a brain that's unique. And our brains are unique for two reasons. One is, you have parents who are different from my parents. You have genes that you inherited from your parents that are different from your parents and my parents' genes. But the second thing that's different, that we're only now really beginning to appreciate, is that our brains are different because they are shaped by experience. So all of you sitting in a classroom have had different experiences. All of the different experiences that we have during the course of each day, over the years of our lives, cause the circuitry that develops in our brains to be unique. And that means we're each unique individuals based in part on our genes and in part on our experience. What I'd like to do today is talk about the complexity, the biological complexity of the brain, and then talk about how it gets to be that way during development, and then even get down to the level of the cellular and molecular mechanisms that cause our brains to change every moment of every day. Right now, your brain is different from a moment ago because you can remember that I said brains change moment to moment. Every single moment of experience, our brains are changing at a microscopic level. And what we want to talk about is what's involved there and what it tells us about adolescent brains in particular. So let's start by talking about the brain. This is a lovely model brain. The brain is the most complex object we know of. There is nothing more complex. There are no computers on Earth more complex than this brain. Every single one of us has between our ears an organ that is so complex that we don't know that we'll ever understand it. Each part of the brain has a different function. Some people think of the brain as sort of a bowl of soup. It's not at all. It has very specific parts, and this one can be taken apart. Actually, each of us has two hemibrains. The left part of the brain controls the right part of the body. The right part of the brain generally controls the left part of the body. The brain would sit in my head like this. And if we look inside, we see that each hemisphere, the whole thing was a sphere, each half is a hemisphere. Each hemisphere has a surface coating of this gray material, gray matter, that in this case is called the cerebral cortex, and different parts of the cortex have different functions. We'll come to that in a second. But these two hemispheres sit on a stalk, the brain stem, and the brain stem is what controls how we breathe, heartbeat, sweating, all sorts of things that we think of as sort of vegetative functions. So we're not going to talk about that at all. This is the cerebellum, the little cerebrum, and it's involved in movement. And we could talk about that, but we won't have time to today. So what we're going to focus on is, in fact, these cerebral hemispheres. So this would be my left cerebral hemisphere. And if we turn sideways so that this is the front and this is the back, we can talk about how different parts of the cerebral hemispheres have different functions. So when I'm looking at you, input is coming through my eyes and actually traveling to the very back of my brain, to the visual cortex, for processing. When I hear you talk, or when you're listening to me talk, this part of your brain is lighting up, and it has to do with the temporal lobe of the brain, and we call this the auditory part of the brain. There's also a strip of cortex that receives input from the skin. In fact, there's a nice, neat map of the body on this strip of cortex, and right in front of it is another strip of cortex with a map of which parts of the body's movements are controlled. So we have a sensory map, a motor or movement map, and then in the frontal lobes we have areas that we know very little about, and these are going to be important when we talk about the adolescent brain. These are the very last parts of the brain to develop, and we'll talk about their functions later. The parts we know the most about are the parts that develop early, and what I'm going to do is talk quite a bit about what we know about the development, especially of the visual cortex, because it's what we have to do if we're going to understand the way the rest of the brain develops. So Our brains they're made up of nerve cells that we call neurons, and our brains have something like 20 to 100 billion nerve cells, neurons. That's how many stars there are in the Milky Way. When you look up at the stars at night, on a clear night, and you see this milky path, it's made up, of course, of points of light, the stars, and it's made up of that many billions of stars. You have that many neurons between your ears. Astounding. That's only the beginning. Each nerve cell is a very complex cell. The nerve cells are the most complex cells in the body, and in fact they use the most energy of cells in the body, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But each cell has arms that reach out. So if you're going to send input to me, I just said input from the eye goes through some channels to get to the back of the brain. The way you send input is you send a cellular process out to me. And then I might receive your input and input from some other cells. And then if I was going to send input to somebody else in the class, I would have to grow processes out there. So each nerve cell looks kind of like a spider, and it's got a very precise architecture. And at the ends of all these processes are connections that we call synapses. And each cell makes something like hundreds to thousands of these connections. So we've got thousands of connections being made by billions of neurons. We're up into the trillions of connections. And these connections, most of them, form after birth. So we're born with a rudimentary set of circuitry, and then most of the synapses, most of these connections that are the basis for cells talking to each other and processing information and producing movement and thought and so on, most of those connections form and are stabilized after we're born. So the numbers of connections are beyond our comprehension. We don't know how to think about as many stars as there are in the Milky Way times 1,000 connections. But right there it tells you that your brain can do things you had no idea you could do. Our brains, we have no idea of the limits of the potential of our brains. Our brains are, as I said, the most complex organs, the most complex objects known in the universe. So we have, let's say 100 billion neurons. How do these connections form? We only have 30,000 genes. The Human Genome Project was a surprise. It didn't occur to us really as scientists that we only had 30,000 genes. 30,000 genes laying the rules for the creation of trillions of connections means it can't be that each gene controls one part of the brain or one cell to do the right thing. What the genes do is they lay down rules of development. And it's those rules of development that we're starting to understand in a whole new way in the last couple of decades. What's clear is that we are born with huge potential, with a wiring, the beginnings of a circuitry that's kind of diffuse. Still already precise, but still sparse. And then particular connections are strengthened and other connections are weakened according to rules. And one of the major things guiding that change, that sort of creation of the mature circuitry is experience. So what you do affects which circuits, which connections are strengthened and which connections are weakened, which is why you sometimes hear use it or lose it. That's what use it or lose it is about. If you use it, you will strengthen connections. If you don't use the connection, it may weaken and it may actually disappear. So what I'd like to talk about is how this malleability of the circuitry by experience changes over the course of our lifetimes. When we're born with a highly plastic brain. Now that's the word I'm going to use to describe this changeability in response to experience. So a newborn infant has a brain that is crying out in a way for experience. I'm going to move to animals now because we're going to learn a number of things that you could only learn in animals, and then I'll tell you how they apply to humans. If a kitten, kittens are born with their eyes closed, and after about a week to 10 days, their eyes open. Well, if you just keep the eye closed in a kitten for the first 6 weeks of life, let one eye open but keep the other one closed and let it open at 6 weeks, guess what? The kitten is blind in that eye. There's nothing wrong with the eye, but the circuitry back in the primary visual cortex develops abnormally. It only develops normally in the presence of input to the two eyes. And when those findings were made, actually in the 60s, 1960s, all of a sudden, doctors realized that what the scientists had discovered might help to explain why children born with cataracts, so that the lens isn't clear and light isn't reaching the retina properly. Children born with cataracts, who usually didn't have them removed until they were school age, maybe 5, 6 years old, never could use the eye after the cataract was removed. There was nothing wrong with the eye, but people in my generation, this surgery was often done that late. People in my generation who had this surgery done report just not really being able to see out of that eye. And you say, what do you mean you can't see? Well, everything's kind of a blur. Can you see anything? Yeah, I can tell the light's on, but I don't really use that eye. What we think is happening is that because there wasn't good input to both eyes during a critical early period, cortex didn't develop normal connections. So experiments were done in kittens, and then children started having that surgery done earlier and earlier and earlier. And sure enough, the two lines of research, of inquiry, converged on the notion that in humans, it's during the first 3 years of life that you must have high acuity, high resolution, good, sharp vision in both eyes in order to have normal circuitry develop in the visual cortex. In kittens, it's 6 weeks that is this critical period. In humans, it's about 3 years. If you don't, you never will gain the ability to see with both eyes. You might say, well, maybe that's just important for the visual system, for seeing. Maybe seeing is special. Turns out, if you look at any of the sensory systems, and they've all been looked at now, touch, hearing, it's harder to do with taste, but it's also known to be true with smell. In any of these cases, if early in life an animal or a child is unable to use the sense, what happens is it becomes too late to make the normal circuitry in the brain. So if a child is born deaf, what do you do nowadays? You do everything you can to bring sound input to the brain, to bypass a cochlea that isn't functioning or whatever, to put hearing aids on to just make sounds louder if that's what's required. But you do that very early in a baby. You don't wait till the child is 5 or 6 years old. You do it in a baby, and the child can grow up able to respond to inputs through, say, the hearing aid. Whereas in my generation, if you had waited until the child was 6, got to school, and finally somebody noticed that he or she wasn't hearing through one ear, fitted the person with a hearing aid, you would find that it made no difference. It's because the circuitry over here for receiving input from the ear and processing it and making sense out of it would not have developed normally. So this shows us there's a high degree of plasticity, remember that word, malleability, changeability of the circuitry in response to experience. So when I was in school, in college, it was thought that this was all about early development, but that once a child was 3 or so, probably the brain was mature. Not at all true. We know, all of us, that if you didn't learn a second language before puberty, you probably still, even if you're speaking it 20 or 30 years later, have an accent. Very few people can get rid of an accent if they learn a second language late. And that's been shown to be a function of how late they learned it. Now, different people, this is about the average person. Different people have different skills. But in general, if you didn't learn, and especially hear native speakers of a new language before puberty, You're never going to learn it as well. You won't have the nuances of grammar. You won't sound fluent, native. But if you learned it early, say in elementary school, then you can become very fluent. And look around us, we see this all the time. There's so many kids growing up now in Arizona who speak 2 languages completely comfortably, and their parents, who may have lived here for 30 years, still struggle with the second language, which can be either Spanish or English in the cases I'm thinking of. The kids learned it as though it was easy. Well, it was. Their brains were more plastic when they were learning that second language than the brains of their parents trying to learn the language as an adult. So we knew that there was this language learning capability that seemed to sort of fall off with adolescence. And there were some few other examples that people referred to commonly to suggest that plasticity might have several levels over the course of life. But a really striking thing happened in the last decade or so, and that is neuroscientists showed that when you look at brain activity, so you can use tests that show which part of the brain is activated in particular tasks. When you use equipment that will let you see brain activity in particular tasks and compare adult brain activity with brain activity in adolescence, something very interesting happens. You notice that different parts of the brain are being used for the same function. And in particular, parts of the brain up here, the frontal lobes, are not well developed and not well used until very late. In fact, way past puberty. In girls, by about the age of 20. In boys, who are take a little longer, a couple of years later, into their early 20s, the frontal lobes are still developing. And what do the frontal lobes do? I told you we would come back to that. The frontal lobes play a really important role in something that we didn't appreciate until recently because it's hard to describe. I've just been talking about seeing, hearing, controlling movement. The frontal lobes are involved in judgment, predicting the future, understanding the consequences of an action today. They're also involved in risk-taking behavior, which of course has to do with judgment. When my son cracked up the car when he was 16, he came home. Both of his parents are neuroscientists. He came home and told us it was his adolescent brain at work. He didn't know he was taking a risk because his frontal lobes weren't quite ready, but he did something he shouldn't have done while he was driving. This opens up all sorts of interesting questions, legal, of course, included, and there are people here at the University of Arizona who are very interested in the legal ramifications of this late frontal lobe development. But for the purposes of thinking about learning and lifelong education, this tells us something really important. The way we process information before our brains are fully developed into their adult circuitry is different from the way adults process. I meant to tell you about one study I find really interesting, one set of studies. If you show teenagers facial expressions, pictures of facial expressions, happy, angry, surprised, concerned, quizzical. I just gave you the names of all of the emotions I think I was showing on my face. You show those pictures to teenagers and adults. Adults would give you the answers I just did. Teenagers will read them as expressing different emotions, which suggests that all those times I was talking to my son and trying to get something across with my face, I might have been communicating something different to him than I meant to communicate. So it reminds us that the adolescent is a different person than he or she will be a few years later in the 20s. So the adolescent brain has lots of the basic circuitry well laid out, very functional, and it's particular areas that have to do with these subtle things like judgment about the future that appear last. So then you might ask, well, after the age of 25, are our brains cast in cement? The answer is no. And you know that I said the answer is no because synapses in your brain change to record memories. So learning and memory, ongoing throughout our lives, is based on exactly the same mechanisms that cells used during development to strengthen one set of connections, to shed other connections that weren't being used or weren't useful. We're doing on a microscopic scale, microscopic changes in the strengths of connections all the time. So while early in life experience can change the circuitry so that you do or do not process inputs from an eye, later in life, those changes are much more subtle. We can't compensate for, say, the absence of input to one eye early on. We can't change the circuitry in an overall way. But all the time, in different parts of our brain, there are microscopic changes that are based on the same molecules, the same mechanism as during development. So what we would say is, different parts of the brain mature at different rates. The mechanisms that underlie experience-dependent plasticity early in life are the ones that underlie experience-dependent memory. Memory is of experience. So memories are our special adult kind of experience-dependent plasticity. It's just at a much more microscopic scale. So I'd like to conclude by saying we're born with a brain that has great capability. In fact, we are born with a brain that could learn to speak as its first language Japanese, or Italian, or Spanish, or Hopi, or English. And it's the family we're born into, the environment we're born into, that will shape the circuitry, mold the circuitry so that we become best at, for instance, making the sounds of the language we hear around us, and losing the ability to make sounds that we would have made if we had been in a family speaking a different language. That's true for language. It's probably true for all sorts of cultural things. We're born with a brain that's very adaptable, and during our early preschool years and then our school years, we are shaping that brain to fit a certain experience. And I think that that's a sort of awe-inspiring thought for us as teachers of students and also as parents. It means that you have an impact that you might never have realized you were having. You can have a biological impact on the circuitry of a child's brain. You are having a biological impact on the circuitry of a child's brain with everything you do. The last thing I'd mention about that is that adrenaline is being shown to have an important effect. We all know that when we were in school, the adrenaline, the nervousness before an exam, made us able to learn all kinds of things in a really short period of time that weeks before you couldn't possibly have forced into your brain. Lots of experiments show that plasticity is higher, certain kinds of plasticity. I'm slightly simplifying this, but certain kinds of plasticity of circuitry are higher when adrenaline levels are high. So the things that will be most memorable are the things that come with either excitement, in a good way, or sometimes trauma. And that's one of the reasons traumatic incidents can have such an impact. Often with trauma comes a rise in adrenaline, and we remember the things that happen to us when adrenaline is high. So again, it reminds us we have an impact on children that is often beyond what we expected, and just reminds us to be careful, to tread lightly. So what I've told you about is a sort of quick overview to the latest ideas in neuroplasticity. And we have to remember, we know this much of a topic that's this big. We're going to learn much more. We're going to understand it in much more detail. But for right now, I think we know enough to know that a young child has different capabilities, different brain capabilities from an older child. Adolescents are different from adults. And we should take this knowledge and use it to its best possible impact in the classroom and at home.